project which has been going on at Uppsala University in Sweden that I've been sort of been part of. And the idea of this project has been to sort of look at how different types of climate hazards, climate-related hazards, are having impact on climate policy. Some parts of the project have been looking at adaptation, and this part of the project has been sort of focusing more on mitigation policy. And this is working on with Charles Parker and Daniel Norstedt at Uppsala University. So our starting point is the fact that Paris Agreement has brought in this pledge and review system for climate commitments, which is sort of expected to have countries are supposed to submit nationally determined contributions. It's supposed to be this sort of continuous pledges, and they're supposed to be sort of ramped up over time, becoming more ambitious. We also know that as there's sort of the recent IPCC report has sort of pointed out, is climate change is already having a huge impact on the globe, and we need sort of to increase ambition. We need to sort of improve the work we're doing to sort of combat climate change, and some of these impacts, what we're sort of seeing from the recent reports also is that some of these impacts are already taking place now. And this sort of has brought us to the question whether these are actually sort of pushing forward policy already now, or have been doing this for a while. These are just some recent examples I've been bringing just to sort of bring some flavor to this topic. So there's a lot of like focus, especially I guess in the US and EU, but you can even see this outside in the rest of the world, where there's discussions about whether forest fires, floods, droughts, whether they're sort of pushing for governments to sort of tackle climate change more robustly or not. And what we're trying to sort of see with this sort of manuscript is whether climate-related hazards are actually related to more ambitious climate pledges or not. There's a lot of expectations, especially when it comes to sort of policy, and also from academic circles. There's a sort of an expectation that this is taking place. What we're looking at is we're looking at the nationally determined contributions, the NDCs, which are sort of what can also be seen as sort of pledges or commitment devices as well. So in a way, we're not just looking particularly at policy as sort of implementation, but we're looking more in terms of what kind of commitments are being made. And there's sort of two parts to this. So one of the things that we've been looking at is, are the NDCs sort of becoming more ambitious based on like recent change in climate-related hazards? Is it the case that there's been more sort of severe, more noticeable hazards taking place in recent times compared to previously, historically? And is that sort of driving this? Or is it the case that there's like a general sense of exposure, vulnerability, like historical experience with climate-related hazards that's sort of pushing this forward? So these are sort of two sort of main ideas behind this. We're kind of drawing a lot from public policy literature, especially sort of about like external shocks. There's a bunch of papers that sort of show obviously about what is the impact of climate hazards or extreme weather events on voting or behavior or opinions about climate change or climate policy. There's also sort of Young has sort of pointed out from 2016 that the Paris Agreement is sort of dependent on the fact that these sort of severe climate shocks are already pushing for rapid changes. So we really like need some sort of external shock, some kind of impact to the system to sort of put it move more in motion. Also, we're kind of drawing on literature on focusing events. There's a lot of, obviously discussions about how disasters are kind of focusing events that bring attention together, and then the public and policymakers sort of come along and start to decide and make decisions on certain key topics. So whether that's the case sort of with these climate hazards as well. So we're kind of trying to figure out also, is it the case that climate hazards are kind of having this focusing event impact as well? So the dependent variable we're using is from a 2018 measurements from Rovio, DuPont, and Mainshausen, who have created warming assessments of nationally determined contribution pledges. They use sort of modeling to and using sort of business as usual modeling, and then trying to see how much are the NDC pledges actually promising to reduce future emissions. They kind of weigh those based on different principles. One of them is capability to pay, sort of what is the future sort of income sort of could be like. They also take into account like historical responsibility, so how much has been emitted previously, and they also weigh by sort of convergence to equal per capita emissions over time as well. But they basically take what they do is they take the weakest sort of those and what has the least impact, and they kind of weigh the NDC warming impact based on that. What they sort of come up with is a scale where they measure potential sort of warming from different countries and based on different NDCs for this century, basically. And when they go is sort of what is the impact of these NDCs, depending on these sort of principles of whether is it from 0.1 degrees or is it to sort of close to 5.1 degrees. And we have kind of reversed that scale. We use we've kept the sort of degree range, but we kept it from sort of low warming to high impact warming sort of as well. Hopefully, yeah. So so some of the IEVs we're using, the main sort of IEV, we use very sort of different variations of this. But what we sort of focus on is we use the MDAT database, which is on climate related hazards. We pick out mainly floods, storms, wildfires, extreme temperature, landslides, and droughts. We use different sort of studies that have in sort of extreme weather events research where they kind of tie these to climatic change as well, or they're more likely to be related to climatic change. We use yearly averages. Obviously, the NDCs are sort of one moment in time, so we don't have that many observations, obviously, because of this. What we do is sort of we construct different variables per year. What we do is we have climate hazard events per year. We have number of deaths. We have the number of sort of people affected by hazards per 100,000 people living in the country, and also economic damage, which we sort of weigh by GDP as well. And sort of based on these kind of two ideas that I talked about in the beginning, we kind of look at whether it's actually the change in impact of hazards that's driving this variation. Was it the case that if in the last 5 years prior to the NDC being submitted was a big increase compared to a historical baseline based on these different sort of variables that we used? And we used also different baselines just in case. We used baselines from 1970, from 1980, 1990 to 2015, so until the Paris Agreement. But we also look at sort of overall vulnerability exposure to hazards. We look at simply the average historical level of hazards based on also these different variables of deaths, affected, number of events, and like financial or economic damage. Well, we have 168 NDCs. We're talking about certain pledges. We're only focusing on the first NDCs, what we have data for, and we use OLS with some controls, and we also check for sort of we sort of control also for GDP per capita and fossil fuel production, which is sort of also has been brought up in previous studies that have looked at the warming potential of NDCs, and these are sort of two aspects that come out. First, sort of looking at change in hazards, what I can say is that we do not find any kind of significant results here. The models are sort of what is how much has the frequency of hazards changed in the prior 5 years prior to the NDC being submitted versus compared to a historical baseline. We use different baselines, but it doesn't seem to change that much. Obviously, what the baseline changes is the data availability, and what it does also is certain countries exist from 1990 or 1991, and certain countries don't exist prior to that at all in the data set. We also, when we use other measures, we've used sort of number of affected, we use damages, also, if we use deaths, for example, then we don't really find any kind of clear signal here. When we look at, which is kind of expected because a lot of studies which look at the impact of climate hazards or extreme weather events do not seem to find some sort of a clear link in either. But when we look at overall vulnerability to hazards, frequency of hazards, perhaps not. But what we do find is that the historical baseline for overall vulnerability to these types of climate hazards that we look at, there does seem to be some connection. Same with deaths, also a little bit tenuous, but seems to be some relationship there. We also find that in some cases we can bring out in the G20 countries, we can also see that Indonesia is sort of a good example, potentially sort of a case study of how a country that's really highly affected but has a pretty relatively ambitious NDC, taking into account the different sort of weights. And Turkmenistan could be brought as a sort of an example, which is kind of not that much affected historically, but also has a very low sort of ambition NDC. Reaching to 5.1 Celsius, or based on that sort of modeling. What I can say is we don't find really much support for this sort of change hypothesis, like recent change in climate hazards being associated with more ambitious NDCs. We do find a little bit of support for the sort of vulnerability hypothesis, so we don't find that countries that were recently in the last 5 years who had like a really clear increase in climate hazards were not the ones that posted more ambitious climate pledges. But the countries that were more vulnerable did. I think we sort of contribute to ongoing academic debate. There's some opportunities here. Paper by Thurstad et al. From 2020, they find that more vulnerable countries did submit more ambitious climate pledges. They use a bit different measures to arrive at that conclusion. And also studies from one of my co-authors, which have looked at impacted cities. They also find that they didn't find that cities recently impacted by climate hazards have increased their ambition of their adaptation policies. So there's some sort of opportunities here to sort of contribute to academic debate as well. Okay, I think I'll finish here. I think I'm running out of time anyway, so